Hey there everyone, this is Samuel Johnson and welcome back to the Neutron Perspectives, and today we're going to be discussing episode 5 of the Adventures of Jimmy Neutron, Raise the Oozy Scab, and I Dream of Jimmy. So, let's talk about the first segment of this episode, Raise the Oozy Scab. What's going on is that Retroville Elementary, or at least Jimmy's class, is doing an they're doing a project on oceanography, and so as part of this project, all the students have to basically group up into teams of 2 and do their own studies regarding the ocean. As such, Jimmy and Cindy end up getting paired up because their go-to lab partners are unavailable. Carl and Sheen because, well, the last time they partnered with Jimmy, they wound up suffering from very dangerous side effects they're still suffering from, and Cindy can't go with Libby because Libby got bribed into doing someone else's project in return for a CD. As such, neither Jimmy or Cindy want this project, and so Jimmy decides he's just going to do his own project and try and cut Cindy out of it. And how he wants to do that is that he builds a submarine, and what he wants to do is that he wants to take the submarine into the Retroville Bay and find a sunken ship called the Oozy Scab, which is supposed to contain a treasure that is, well, basically priceless. And of course, Jimmy is planning on letting Carl and Sheen join him because, well, they're his friends, but Cindy ends up catching wind of the whole expedition because she catches Jimmy before he ships out since, well, it's a reluctant partnership and she's just trying to make it work. And when she hears what Jimmy's plan is, she's like, okay, I'm in. And I love how she does it. It's not like, you're not cutting me out of this. She's just like, okay, I'm down for this. Let's do it. And as such, basically they get the four of them end up taking the submarine into the Retroville Bay. And well, Cindy's plan is that she thinks that she's found where the Oozy Scab could be, as she has a map and she's basically mapped out where the Oozy Scab could be based on ocean currents, where it sank, and just basically sciencey stuff. Basically what one would do when they're normally navigating the ocean looking for stuff. But Jimmy being Jimmy and, well, not wanting to admit that Cindy actually did something competently, has his own means of trying to find the Oozy Scab, as he's basically rigged up a radio to, well, communicate with fish. He calls it the gill gum, I think is what it is. Basically, you speak into a microphone connected to the radio, and it basically translates what you're saying into sonar that the fish can understand. And through that, you can, well, just communicate with the fish. Of course, Carl and Sheen use it to play around, or at least Carl does. Sheen ends up basically trying to interrogate the fish, and it doesn't work. But Jimmy wants to use this exclusively to find the Oozy Scab, and he just completely disregards Cindy's attempts to want to find it. Unfortunately, though, it leads to the quartet of kids basically getting lost for hours, as Jimmy keeps questioning fish after fish and basically gets no leads. How when we end up checking back in with the submarine, we see that he's talking with a fish that's just rambling on and on and on about its relationship issues. As such, Cindy is getting annoyed with Jimmy and basically tells him that they need to follow the map, but Jimmy doesn't want to listen to Cindy at all. And as such, even though things are kind of going grim, the submarine just keeps piloting on and unfortunately, nobody knows where the hell they are by the end of it. To the point where when Jimmy goes to check above water to see where they are, he asks if anyone's familiar with the seas of Japan. So, yeah, they're very much off course. I didn't even know they could go out that far. But then again, they say they've been traveling for hours, so what do I know? Maybe this is over a weekend. Point is, Jimmy's basically lost and nobody knows where he is, and justifiably, Cindy is kind of pissed at Jimmy for not going with her plan, and she basically says that they're going to do things her way. Of course, Jimmy tries saying, no, I'm the captain here, I'm in charge of all this, but Cindy cites that since they're lab partners, that technically makes her co-captain, and by basically maritime law of submarines, or whatever the hell that book was, because she did have a book called The Big Book of Submarines. Basically, it means that she has the authority to basically have Jimmy locked up. Of course, Jimmy thinks that Carl and Sheen wouldn't dare do this, but I have to remind you that these kids have been traveling for hours. Carl and Sheen are starving, and they want to get this over with, so they end up complying with Cindy, tie Jimmy up, and throw him in a makeshift brig. As such, with Cindy at the helm, they are able to get the submarine under control, and sure enough, within I don't know how long, I'm guessing if they're in the seas of Japan, it took them hours to get back to Retroville, they do manage to find the Oozy Scab. So hey, it looks like Cindy's plans actually did work out. Unfortunately, before they can retrieve the treasure, they end up getting attacked by a giant squid. And unfortunately, when Cindy tries communicating with the squid via the gill gum device, it doesn't seem to be understanding them. So it looks like that the kids are screwed, and, well, Cindy ends up turning to Jimmy for help, but Jimmy refuses to help unless Cindy admits that he's smarter, nicer, and all-around better person. And while Cindy is at first reluctant to do that, well, the threat of imminent death finally convinces her to try and actually admit it, and when she actually does, she ends up wiping her mouth out with soap. Regardless, though, she does admit it, and so Jimmy's let out of his cell, and he goes to check the gill gum device to see why it isn't working with the squid. Well, it turns out the reason for this is because the device is configured to only communicate with fish, and squid are kind of a different breed. However, Jimmy has a workaround for this, where you see, throughout this entire segment, Carl has been snacking on something called fish snackums, and it turns out, while the fish snackums advertise that they're made from fish, apparently they're also made from freeze-dried squid. And as such, Jimmy uses that to advantage by getting a piece of the fish snackums and just putting it on a microchip and putting that microchip back into the gill gum device. In his own words, by putting squid DNA in the device, it'll allow it to communicate with squids. I guess. I don't know. It's a cartoon about a kid who builds a submarine in his garage. I'm gonna let this slide. But either way, it does allow the group to contact the squid, and they do just tell him, "We're here for the treasure chest in that ship over there. We don't mean you any harm." And the squid's like, "Oh, why didn't you say so? And here I was planning to rip your heads open and eat your insides." I actually gotta love that. But yeah, the squid ends up helping, as it does let Jimmy and Co. go, and does end up getting them the treasure chest. So hey, it looks like that everything's going well, and Jimmy even admits that they'll all share the treasure equally. We cut to school on another day as we see Jimmy and Cindy presenting the treasure chest, and it turns out it's full of saltwater taffy. And apparently it's really damn good saltwater taffy. And apparently every bit of saltwater taffy in there is worth 3 cents each. So yeah, Jimmy pretty much threatened his and his friends' lives for candy. I mean, admittedly, it's probably good candy, and Mrs. Fowl is ending to say if what Mrs. Fowl said is true. But yeah, Jimmy is ashamed about this. Although he and Cindy do get an A+, so hey, it's not all bad. Oh, whatever. But anyway, that brings us to the second segment, I Dream of Jimmy. What's going on in this segment is that Carl is a bit sleep deprived. In the middle of experiments, he's just conked out and can't do his part as part of the testing, since he's Jimmy's favorite test subject. And while Jimmy at first assumes that Carl is sleepy because he hasn't gotten enough food, well, Carl admits that it's just that he hasn't been getting enough sleep. And the reason for that is because he's been having nightmares involving, as he calls it, spooky things that chase him that he can never outrun. And Jimmy just kind of scoffs at that, because whenever he encounters weird things in his dreams, he basically presents he presents a scientific theorem that basically just scientifically proves that what he's afraid of cannot logically exist, and his brain just makes it vanish. But in Carl's case, he can't do that. His dreams have no logic. They operate on very pure dream logic. Everything that can happen will happen. Nothing adds up. Even Carl admits at one point he married a turkey in one of his dreams. And on top of that, Jimmy isn't around to explain all this stuff to him, so he can't just piece it all together on a whim. As such, Jimmy thinks that he has the exact device to try and help Carl out. And as such, one flash cut to Jimmy's lab later, we see Carl hooked up to a device called the Dream... hold on one second, I'm going to look up the name. The Dream Injector 5000. And what the Dream Injector does is that it's a portal into your dreams. It has a little tube that you hook onto your nose, and the nose basically projects your dreams into the portal and allows whoever enters the portal to physically enter your dreams. And as such, Jimmy thinks that if he just use this device and goes into Carl's mind, he can basically help him with whatever the hell is scaring him and just allow Carl a good night's sleep. Of course, Carl has to go through his whole ritual in order to go to sleep, because as we saw in the movie, his mother does have a little ritual to help him go to sleep, including a lullaby that goes, "Nani, nani, nani." But sure enough, after Jimmy and Sheen end up replicating this nightly ritual, Carl does fall asleep, and so Jimmy is able to enter the portal and go right into his brain. Which actually also led to a funny gag where Carl asked if the machine would hurt, and Jimmy said, "Oh no, it won't hurt me at all." I love that. But either way, Jimmy does arrive in the dream, and, well, the dream goes the way it does. There's enough reality there to keep it grounded, but it's clear that something's weird. It's clear that the whole thing is just off. There's an otherworldly haze surrounding the area and while the area is Jimmy's main classroom, there are llamas in the classroom. Libby goes to school on a leg because her paddle broke. I am not going to explain any further because I think it's funnier, and Miss Fowl is sitting on her desk is basically nesting eggs. However, the biggest difference between the dream world and the real world, besides most of the obvious stuff, is that in the dream world, Carl's a genius. Well, sort of. Obviously, it's Carl's idea of what a genius is, as he presents a new device to the class, and of course, as he tries to explain how it works, it's just obviously made up technobabble because, well, let's be honest, someone of Carl's intellectual standing wouldn't be able to understand anything that Jimmy does. Hell, I'm 30 years old and even I don't understand all of it. Point is, in Carl's world, he's the genius, which at first Jimmy marvels at and even comments on, but then Dream Cindy tells Jimmy that, just kind of But Dream Cindy ends up telling Jimmy that he's a moron. Yeah, well, the exact words that Jimmy used are that in Carl's dreams, he thinks he's a genius like me. And that caused Cindy to laugh at him and state that he's so dumb he can't even spell his name. And sure enough, Jimmy looks at a paper on his desk, and it has his name poorly written over and over until he just settled on Bob. And on top of that, it appears that Carl has some subconscious animosity towards his kid genius best friend, because when Carl asks for a test subject to try out his new invention, well, it ends up going to Jimmy, as he calls him a dumb but willing test subject, which I kind of love that. As such, Jimmy is forced up to the front of the classroom. Oh, actually, he gets out of his desk and tries to talk to Carl, and Carl forces him into the device. But Jimmy just thinks that, But Jimmy, while in the midst of trying to explain to Carl that this is all a dream, well, he notices that the device isn't wired properly, and which I kind of find amusing, considering that it's basically just a cardboard box with a few electrodes plugged into it. But basically, he just says that all this device is going to do is just give him 10,000 volts. But Carl ends up activating the device anyway, and sure enough, what Jimmy did say would happen does happen, as he's zapped to hell and back, but he felt it. Like, he actually felt it. And Jimmy realizes that while this may be a dream, if something bad happens to him here, it will actually hurt him. As such, Jimmy's first plan is just to bail out because, well, now there's an element of danger. Unfortunately, when he calls out to Sheen to wake Carl up so Jimmy can leave, well, it turns out that Carl's nightly routine worked too well because Sheen is conked out as well. As such, Jimmy tries going back to plan A as he tries to convince Carl this is all a dream, but Carl's not listening, as unfortunately, the dream logic is at an extreme high. As when Jimmy tries explaining that everything here doesn't make sense because it's a dream, Carl just kind of accepts it as normal. And even when Jimmy tries telling him that none of this makes sense, he's like, what are you talking about? Of course it all makes sense. This is obviously reality. If it wasn't reality, could I do this? And he pulls out his brain, and I love it, as glasses on it. As such, Jimmy realizes he can't apply real-world logic to this, and he tries further explain to Carl by even touching his shoulder, but that causes everyone in the class to just gasp as he would dare touch the great Carlness, and as such, he's sent to the Ultra Principal, i.e. Sheen in an Ultralord mask, and Jimmy is sentenced to be Carl's monkey boy for 1 badrillion years or whatever, even presenting a contract with Jimmy's poorly written name. As such, Jimmy is sent to wherever the hell Carl is now, which is apparently an alley full of doors and clocks, where he's being fanned by his parents, i.e. Jimmy's parents, and as such, when Jimmy arrives as Carl's monkey boy, Jimmy tries to once again explain that he's here to help Carl with the spooky things, but all that gets is Carl freaking out because who told the monkey boy about the spooky things? As Jimmy is able to kind of fumble his way out of this because, well, real world logic is failing him, so he needs to try dream logic. And thankfully it does work out as he explains to Carl that Carl himself told him while he was riding a bicycle backwards with no wheels up a pyramid while in a ballerina tutu. As such, Carl's mind basically makes enough connections for him to believe that, and he tells Jimmy that the spooky things are under a nearby bed. As such, Jimmy goes to see what it is, and underneath the bed, it's a walking lima bean, which first Jimmy thinks is silly because, well, Carl admitted earlier in the episode that he's not a fan of lima beans, but the instant Jimmy turns his back on this thing, it ends up growing, and, well, it turns into something truly to be feared as its mouth opens wide and it's got like rows upon rows of sharp teeth and is very much intent on eating Jimmy and Carl. So, they gotta run. As such, when they do run, Jimmy tries using his whole rationally explain why this thing can't work thing, but again, Carl's dream world is too irrational. Even when he tries giving Carl a pen to write everything down, the pen turns into a worm. And likewise, when they do manage to hide from the lima bean monster, they end up running into Carl's turkey wife. As such, Jimmy realizes he needs to bail out, but he can't do that unless Carl wakes up. And any attempt on Jimmy's part to convince Carl this is the dream falls on deaf ears because in the dream world, dream logic is just supreme, which makes sense. When you're in a dream, you tend to ignore real world logic until only just before you wake up. As such, Jimmy decides that if he wants to get Carl awake, he needs to hit him with something so outlandish that Carl will have no choice but to accept this as a dream. And an opportunity presents itself as Dream Cindy arrives, saying that she was trying to wash Carl's brain, and, well, Jimmy pulls her in for a kiss, and that is so outlandish that even Carl realizes, oh my god, I must be dreaming. And as such, the dream just kind of fades away as the portal reappears, and Jimmy runs through it and gets back into and he ends up back into the real world as Carmel's waking up. As such, Jimmy tries catching his breath as well. He basically went through a living nightmare on his part. But the nightmare ain't over, because it turns out there is one other resident of Carl's dream that made it into the real world, as the monster lima bean ends up coming out of the back of the portal, and once Carl, Sheen, and Jimmy ends up seeing it, they all run! Thankfully, though, things work out. As we cut to later in Jimmy's house, as we see the lima bean is now dead and is being cut up on the dining room table, and apparently all Jimmy had to do was just smack it with a hammer, and it worked out. As such, they're just, I guess, eating the lima bean, or at least Jimmy and Sheen are. Carl doesn't like those things, so obviously he's not eating it. But Jimmy asks Carl not to tell anyone about what he had to do to wake Carl up, and Carl just kind of says, oh, sure, while just kind of shadily looking side to side. And the episode ends as Cindy bursts into Jimmy's kitchen, tells Jimmy, not even in his dreams, Neutron, before slapping him and walking out. So, hey, at least Carl did indeed tell someone, so there you go. But yeah, my thoughts on these segments. First, Raise the Oozy Scab. I like this episode. I actually really like it. I think this is the first episode so far where we've actively seen Cindy take part in whatever it is that Jimmy's doing. And I'm okay. Let me rephrase that. There have been, in the earlier episodes, we have seen Cindy in on the action with Jimmy when things have gone down. But in this case, we never really seen her be part of the central cast unless she's a necessity. Like in last week's episode with Granny Baby, Jimmy only went to her because he had no other options, and so she wound up helping out because, in her own words, maternal instincts. In this episode, however, I like that Cindy is immediately there in the midst of the action. She's not shanghaied into joining, it's just something's going on, she wants to take part in it. Now, admittedly, the only reason she is taking part in it is because she and Jimmy are lab partners in their oceanography project, but at the very least, I like seeing her be a part of the main cast. So again, from other episodes, like I said, in other episodes, while Cindy has helped take part in a few things, usually, from the outset, she usually either comes in as like an opponent or an antagonistic force, or because she's just shanghaied in because Jimmy has no options. Here, however, to see her actually joining in with the main cast and doing her own thing, I like it. It's nice. And quite frankly, I like the conflict with her and Jimmy in this episode. We know that Jimmy and Cindy are not going to get along in the series because, well, they're prepubescent kids, and of course, as kids are wont to do, they're trying to constantly one-up one another, not just because they're a boy and a girl, but because Cindy wants to knock Jimmy down a few pegs, and I'm saying all that in air quotes, and wants to try and prove that she's smarter. Naturally, of course, Jimmy is going to try and clash with her because that's what he's want to do in that situation, and so seeing them butt heads in this episode when they are forced to work together actually feels very natural, and it leads to both of them actually making some pig-headed mistakes. Now the thing is, while Cindy is not an incompetent character, it has been shown that when it comes down to her versus Jimmy in terms of intelligence, Jimmy wins. We've seen that in a few episodes here and there, and even in the original movie, as she's presented projects that she was so factually sure were true, only for Jimmy to come along and say, actually, no, this is what really happened. It's one of the few times when we actually see him just try and flex his proverbial muscles in her face. Because, well, like I said, the pre-existing rivalry. But in this case, what I like about that is that the rivalry is now acting like even more of a hindrance. In most other episodes, the rivalry tends to be what drives Jimmy to do the things he does. In this episode, however, the rivalry actually pushes Jimmy to be actively stupid. Because, well, this is one of the times where we actually see that when Cindy isn't trying to compete to prove who's smartest, she's actually a rather competent character. As when she hears that Jimmy's plan is to find the Oozy Scab and raid its treasure, she actually does create a rather competent plan to find the ship. As she has a map that maps out where it could be in the Retroville Bay, and thinks that if they just follow the coordinates, they can find it no problem. But because Jimmy wants to prove that he's better than Cindy, he has another method in place, and he refuses to even consider Cindy's option. And as a result, he and his friends end up getting horribly lost. And it's only when they follow Cindy's suggestion that they actually manage to find the ship. But likewise, Jimmy's plan does actually does help the group in the end, because when they find the ship, they end up being attacked by a giant squid, and it's only thanks to Jimmy's genius that they're able to get out of that. And it's a nice little subtle way of showcasing that when Jimmy and Cindy actually are working in conjunction, they can do some rather impressive things. We've seen that in other episodes, as when Jimmy and Cindy aren't butting heads. In previous episodes, we've seen that they actually can work well together. When they're working toward a common goal, they actually can mesh as a team, and I like that. I like the chemistry in those episodes. In this episode, however, what I like is that it showcases that mentality through their hatred for one another. Again, hatred in air quotes. It's more just a rivalry, but the thing is, the only reason that things worked out in the end was by Jimmy and Cindy just working together. Whether either of them are willing to admit it or not, it was both of them using their own inventions and ideas that got them out of the messes they were in. Jimmy's plan to use the Gilgum device to talk to fish and find the Oozy Scab ended horribly with the group getting lost, and it was only thanks to Cindy taking charge of the submarine that they found it. But likewise, it was that very same invention and Jimmy's means of it and Jimmy's genius in adapting to the situation that got them out of being eaten by the giant squid. So yes, so it does show that when Jimmy and Cindy actually are working in conjunction with one another, they can accomplish some pretty impressive stuff. And likewise, I like that the conflict in the episode was twofold. It wasn't just one side being stubborn versus another. Both sides are being actively dumb. Now, admittedly, Jimmy in the beginning was definitely a driving force in that one, as he refused to even consider Cindy's idea when they were looking for the ship. But likewise, near the end of the episode, when they actually do find the ship and they're in danger, it's almost Cindy that gets them in hot water. Well, okay, no pun intended there. And likewise, so seeing her actually have to basically admit that Jimmy's better than her is the only way that she's willing to play along, which that is definitely what kids would do in that situation. We are about to die, you gotta help us. I'm not gonna help you unless you admit I'm better than you. That's just what kids do. Kids are brats. So what can you do? So I like that. I actually like that. But likewise, I do like that by the end of the episode, they just were fighting for Taffy. I genuinely love that. I mean, yeah, it got kind of the desired result, as they brought the Taffy back to school, and as a result of that, they got an A+, because it was some of the best saltwater Taffy that Miss Fowl ever tasted. And so, hey, Jimmy and Cindy at least accomplished something with the project. But likewise, they nearly got lost in the ocean and eaten by a squid just for fucking candy. And this was all Jimmy's idea. So, it's kind of funny seeing Jimmy basically banging his head against the treasure chest while Cindy sort of rubs it in, I think this is actually one of those moments where I feel maybe it is a little justified for Cindy to rub it in. Because again, this was all Jimmy's idea, so what can you do? But hey, it at least got them somewhere. It at least got them what they wanted in the end. So likewise, I think the episode does work. Again, it's nice. I like how the rivalry does add to the conflict in this episode, with Jimmy and Cindy basically becoming their own, basically acting as the problems for basically the ones inciting all the issues in the episode. And I genuinely enjoy that. I like the jokes that are spread throughout, especially when Carl and Sheen are playing with the Gilgum device, which is nice. which is nice. I like the finale when they actually do find the treasure chest and it turns out it's Taffy. And likewise, again, I do like that how the conflicts are ultimately resolved is by Jimmy and Cindy basically having to learn to coordinate with one another, even if both of them don't actively want to admit that they had to rely on the other in some way, shape, or form in order to get it. So overall, fun episode, enjoyable, nice stuff. Likewise, I Dream of Jimmy is definitely another episode where I feel like that the writers were allowed to just be a little more fun. When you have dream episodes in shows, it allows you to not be restricted by the rules. And I don't mean that in the sense of just like story progression, because obviously when you're writing a dream or some other fictional reality in a show, like an alternate timeline or whatever, it allows you to break a few rules here and there, because when you have stuff like this, you can just mess around and have fun, and it won't impact the main canon of the show you're in. So likewise, having an episode that's purely focused in a dream and is basically only operates on pure dream logic, it leads to a lot of fun setups, and I think the episode kind of takes advantage of them. I say kind of because it doesn't go as out there as you want, but it definitely is otherworldly strange, and it does feel like you're stepping into someone's dream, as there is no rhyme or reason to any of the logic in the dream. It seems to shift locations and setting on a whim, and likewise, even when real-world logic is attempted to be applied, it just doesn't work out, because in a dream, you make your own logic. And so likewise, if basically, let me put it this way, in reality, A leads to B. In a dream, A will go to Z, then F, then Q, then R, then Q, then R, then to Z, then to Q again, and then back to Z. And then Z, and then all the way to B again. My point is, in a dream, anything can happen. And I think they actually do replicate that well for the episode, as seeing Carl's dream and basically seeing Jimmy have to suffer through the dream and how it just goes off in its own directions. I think it's fun. Excuse me one second. Sorry about that. But so again, I like that. I think it's fun. It's fun just kind of seeing Jimmy have to try and navigate through Carl's dream. And like I said, I think they do replicate the dream aesthetic really well. And honestly, the humor throughout the episode is a lot of fun. Again, going back to how this thing is just a dream that operates on its own logic, it's just out there, but it's fun. It's just kind of fun. It's fun seeing Libby have to row her way to school with a plastic leg. It's fun seeing Carl act like a genius even though he clearly has no idea what a scientific terminology is. It's fun seeing Sheen be the ultra principal. It's fun seeing Carl believe that he is Jimmy, or that he's Judy and Hugh's son. And likewise, I kind of love how, as I said in the plot summary, that the dream kind of showcases that Carl basically, he has a lot of unconscious animosity towards Jimmy. Like, consciously, he loves Jimmy. Jimmy's one of his best friends. But at the same time, Jimmy has admitted a couple times that Carl is his go-to when it comes to testing out his experiments. With only the more dangerous experiments being reserved for other subjects. So considering how in the last segment, Carl and Sheen both admitted they didn't want to work with Jimmy because they didn't want to suffer any adverse side effects from whatever the hell his project was, you could argue that Carl, whether aware of it or not, has probably built up a little bit of animosity towards Jimmy, and has probably at least on more than one occasion wished that their situations were reversed. So likewise, seeing the dream actually bring that into reality, and seeing Carl take full advantage of that, and basically just force Jimmy into the position of being the new Carl. It's actually pretty fun. It's honestly pretty fun. Actually, is a little interesting. I doubt it's going to add anything to his character because Carl's ultimately a very amicable guy and just kind of goes with the flow with everything. And he trusts Jimmy implicitly. So I doubt he'd ever do anything to want to hurt him. It's just at the same time, it's interesting seeing it's nice seeing subconscious desires be reflected in a dream, whether the dreamer is actively trying to push them or not. So, again, like it. It's fun. So again, like that. I genuinely like that. So when it comes down to it, I Dream of Jimmy, fun stuff, and I loved the stuff with the Lima Bean. I loved seeing the dream thing come to life and how apparently off-screen Jimmy just took it down with a hammer. Also seeing Jimmy get slapped by Cindy because she heard that he kissed her to get out of a dream. So what can you do? But overall, both these episodes are really fun. The Raise the Oozy Scab is a nice little adventure that actually does well with good character actually does well with the character conflicts given, and does lead to an honestly does lead to a fun seafaring adventure that ultimately has a good and humorous payoff. And likewise, I Dream of Jimmy is definitely a very creative and enjoyable and fun episode that definitely just well, like a dream, operates on its own rules and is just fun to watch as a result. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed the video. I thank you for watching. I'm Samuel Johnson, and I'll hope to see you next week. Take care.